Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Perry Johnson Registrars webinar, ISO 13485-2016. Are you ready for this? My name is Shannon Craddock, and I'm the Programs and Accreditations Manager at PJR, and I welcome you today. Today we'll be talking about the transition process for 13485-2016, as well as giving an overview of some of the new and revised requirements. In order to ensure sound quality, participants have been muted. If you have a question or need to make a comment, please type them into the question feature, and I'll answer as many of these as possible at the conclusion of today's webinar. A question that we always get is, can I access a recording of today's webinar to share with my colleagues? Or am I able to get a copy of the slides? And the answer is yes. These are available for download in about 24 to 48 hours after the conclusion of today's webinar from our website. That's www.pjr.com. So today we'll be talking about the transition process, what's required, what's the timeline. I'll give an overview of some of the changed, new, as well as a deleted requirement, and then there'll be time for questions and answers. And again, please type them into the question feature of the GoToWebinar. So the ANAB, which is the accreditation body based in the United States, and PJR's accreditation body for ISO 13485, published a document called Heads Up 340, which can be downloaded from their website, anab.org, that describes the transition process for both certification bodies and certification body clients. So as we all know, the new version of 13485 was published on the 1st of March 2016. The International Accreditation Forum's resolution, drafted back in 2015, detailed the transition period of 3 years from the date of publication. PJR had to apply to migrate its accreditation from 2003 to 2016. And once approved, a CB can issue certificates to the new version of the standard. PJR is approved and accredited to issue 13485-2016 certificates. Based on the 3-year transition plan, PJR is encouraging clients to transition on their recertification audit. Because of the lengthy transition period, if you do it at your recertification audit, no time will be added for the transition. If your readiness or the due date of your recertification make this unfriendly, then you can transition on a surveillance audit, but we will add a half day of time, on-site time, to your audit in order to adequately cover the new requirements. PJR has set an internal deadline of the 1st of December 2018 for your last transition audit to be conducted. So what this means is if you normally have a December anniversary date, you'll want to make sure that you do your audit in November, if at all possible, to allow sufficient time for corrective actions, audit package review, and certification decision. If you have an audit before the 1st of December 2018, we will guarantee transition by the 1st of March 2019, which is the obsolescence date of ISO 13485-2003. So let's get into the new and changed requirements, starting first with section 0.1 general. And here we see that there's more detail regarding the types of organizations covered by 13485-2016, and specifically the life cycle stages covered. So it covers organizations involved in design and development, always has included organizations involved in production, but now also storage and distribution, installation and servicing, final decommissioning and disposal of medical devices, and the design, development, and provision of associated services. The types of organizations that 13485 is applicable to can be suppliers or external parties that provide product, such as raw materials, component parts, or assemblies, calibration or sterilization services, and distribution and maintenance services. All of these types of organizations are applicable for 13485. So I get a lot of questions from organizations that just make component parts saying, I don't need to comply with regulatory requirements. Where does it say I need to comply with regulatory requirements? So 1345, 2016 requires your organization to identify its role under applicable regulatory requirements. Are you a manufacturer? Are you a component part manufacturer? Are you making a subassembly? Are you a distributor? And then identify the applicable regulatory requirements that apply to its activities under these roles. Now, if you're making a component part and there's a recall, there's certain actions. If you're the legal manufacturer of the device and there's a recall, there's certain actions that you have to take, certain reporting that needs to be done. But if you're making a component part, wouldn't you want to do some reporting to your customer so they can determine if a recall is needed? So it's very important that as a component part manufacturer, you're understanding that there are regulatory requirements that apply. And once you determine what these are, certainly it may not be all of them, you have to incorporate these applicable regulatory requirements within your QMS. .2 clarification of concepts. As appropriate is determined to be appropriate unless an organization can justify otherwise. A requirement is considered appropriate if it's necessary for compliance with applicable regulatory requirements or the organization to manage its risk. So you'll see the words as appropriate numerous times in the standard. Always assume that it needs to be applied if it relates to regulatory issues or if it's needed to help you manage your risks, which will happen a lot. We're going to see the theme of risk and compliance with regulatory requirements come up many times in the new version of the standard. Risk pertains to the safety or performance of the medical device or meeting applicable regulatory requirements. And this extends beyond product realization. Furthermore, in clarification of concepts, whenever the term documented is used, it's meant to mean established, implemented, and maintained. So you'll see in the 1345 standard that they don't repeat the words that are often found in other standards. When they mean documented, it means established, implemented, and maintained. It's implied. And unlike 9001-2015, where the word product can also mean service, they now stipulate in 9001-2015 product or service. 1345 product is also understood to mean service. So in 1345, you're only going to see the word product. There's some added requirements that really drive the process approach to quality management. Of course, you have to understand and meet requirements. Consider your processes in terms of added value. So figure out what processes are needed for your organization. Measure those processes so you can obtain results of process performance or effectiveness. And then based on this objective measurement, take actions to improve your processes if needed. Section 1, scope. This section again reiterates the expanded applicability of the standard in terms of life cycle stages, design, development, manufacture, installation, servicing, transport, and the inclusion of suppliers and external parties, calibration entities, component and subassembly suppliers. Outsourced processes are the responsibility of the organization and are to be accounted for in the organization's QMS by monitoring, maintaining, and controlling the process. So if you outsource anything, sometimes manufacturing is even outsourced. You are ultimately responsible for it. You need to control your supplier. That level of control is proportionate to the level of risk based on the product or service that's provided by that supplier. There's that word risk rearing its head again. There's also clarification that requirements in Section 6 and 8, as well as those in Section 7, can be justified as non-applicable. You'll note here that ISO 13485 hasn't adopted the Annex SL formatting, the 10 sections. It still is maintaining the 8 sections that we saw in 9001-2008 and 13485-2003. There are a number of new terms and definitions in Section 3. I could do a whole webinar on just the new terms and definitions, so I've selected just a few to highlight in today's presentation. The first is authorized representative, which is the natural or legal person established within a country or jurisdiction who has received a written mandate from the manufacturer to act on his or her behalf for specified task with regard to the latter's obligations under that country or jurisdiction's legislation. 3.4, a complaint. And I've chosen to highlight this because the definition of the complaint in 1345-2003 is different than the 9001-2015 definition. Some type of communication that alleges deficiencies related to the identity, quality, durability, reliability, usability, safety, or performance of a medical device that has been released from the organization's control or is related to a service that affects the performance of a medical device. Distributor is the natural or legal person in the supply chain who, on his own behalf, furthers the availability of the medical device to the end user. There may be more than one in the supply chain. It's important to note that entities or people involved in storage, transport, on behalf of the manufacturer, importer, or distributor are not distributors under this definition. An importer is the natural or legal person in the supply chain who is first in a given country to make a medical device manufactured in another country or jurisdiction available in the country or jurisdiction where it is to be marketed. Manufacturer, and I encourage you to spend some time studying this definition as I'm not covering it in its entirety, is the natural or legal person with responsibility for design and or manufacture of a medical device with the intention of making the medical device available for use under his name, whether or not such a medical device is designed and or manufactured by that person himself or on his behalf by another person. Important change to note, if you were using the 1345-2003, you'll note that italicized font was used to call out the 1345 specific requirements. This is no longer used in the 2016 version of the standard. So let's dig into the auditable requirements in sections 4 through 8. 411 general requirements. The organization shall document the roles undertaken by the organization under the applicable regulatory requirements. Examples include manufacturer, authorized representative, importer, or distributor. You may also be a manufacturer of component parts or assemblies. 4.1, again hitting on the process approach that we talked about earlier. The organization has to determine the processes needed for its QMS and the application of these processes throughout the organization, taking into account the roles undertaken by the organization. Apply a risk-based approach to the control of the appropriate processes needed for the quality management system. For example, if you're outsourcing the manufacture of a component part, you certainly will want to make sure that that external provider to your organization is strictly controlled. There's a lot of risk associated with the component part that they're supplying. A through C, changes to QMS processes need to be evaluated for their impact on the QMS, medical devices, and controlled in advance with 1345 and regulatory requirements. So essentially, you need a change management process that keeps in mind the requirements of 1345, but also applicable regulatory requirements and any notifications that need to be made. .415 talks about outsourcing, and we see this a lot in a number of standards. If an organization makes a business decision to outsource a process that affects product conformity, they need to monitor and control the process. And the extent and level of monitoring and control is directly proportionate to the risk associated with that outsourced process. The organization itself is ultimately responsible for conformance to 1345 and any customer-specific or regulatory requirements. And again, control should be proportionate to the risk involved and the ability of the external party to meet requirements. So if you're outsourcing the manufacture of a printed circuit board that goes into an active and plannable device, and that entity that manufactures the printed circuit board for you is 1345 certified, the level of control can be proportionate to the fact that there is a certification body going in there and conducting an audit. They're maintaining a certification. Important to note that control shall include written quality agreements. So you need to have written agreements with these external service providers or external providers that are making the parts for you, and flow down any requirements in writing. .416, an organization shall document procedures for validating computer software used in the QMS. Software needs to be validated, of course, prior to the use and in response to any changes. The level and extent of the revalidation process shall be proportionate to the risk associated with the use of the software. So if you have a device with embedded software, certainly maybe more validation is needed than if the software is part of your MRP system. And of course, you want to maintain records of all these validation activities. Section 423 talks about the medical device file. For each medical device or medical device family, the organization shall establish and maintain a file that contains or references the documents required by 1345 or applicable regulatory requirements. And the bulleted list below indicates what the file needs to contain. A general description of the device, the specifications for the product, procedures for manufacturing, packaging, storage, handling, and distribution, procedures for measuring and monitoring, requirements for installation and servicing as appropriate. 424 addresses control of documents. There is a required procedure here, and remember, a documented procedure also means it needs to be established, implemented, and maintained. The procedure needs to include the requirement of addressing controls to prevent the deterioration or loss of documents, whether they're hard copy or electronic. Control of records. The organization is required to define and implement methods for protecting confidential health information contained in records in accordance with regulatory requirements. Some medical devices, especially those with embedded software, may have personal health information. So how is this information protected? Your control of records procedure needs to address this. 5.6 management review. Change here is that there is now a requirement for a documented procedure for management review. As always, the top management must review the QMS at documented plan intervals. And there are some new inputs in 5.6.2. Feedback is the term used. Previously, it was customer feedback, so more general feedback that may come from a variety of sources. Regulatory agencies, your employees or other interested parties, suppliers, your certification body. Complaints and reporting to regulatory authorities all need to be discussed in management review. Moving to section 6.2, a requirement for a documented procedure that describes your process for establishing competence, providing for any needing training, and ensuring the awareness of personnel. So organizations do a good job of putting training records into employee folders. Where they often fall short is the documented process for identifying what the competency requirements are and describing the process for that activity, determining what competency requirements are and ensuring any deficiencies are addressed. Six three, the organization has to document the requirements for infrastructure needed to prevent product mix-up and ensure the orderly handling of product. This could be floor layout diagrams, travelers, or work orders. Infrastructure has been clarified to include information systems, and maintenance has been clarified to be applicable to equipment used in production, as well as that of controlling the work environment and monitoring and measurement. The organization has to document the requirements for the work environment needed to achieve conformity to product requirements, maybe certain temperature, humidity, or sterility requirements that need to be met. Clean room, for example, certain PPE, electrostatic discharge, all that will fall under 641. Contamination control. If a medical device is sterile, the organization has to document the requirements for control of contamination with microorganisms or particulate matter and maintain required cleanliness throughout the process. Section 7 takes us into the product realization process. And of course, the first step is always planning. Planning of product realization is addressed in 7.1b. The organization needs to provide resources specific to the product, including infrastructure and work environment. So essentially what this is saying is understanding what the requirements are for the product and making sure you've given your team the tools it needs to succeed in terms of infrastructure and work environment. 7.1c, the organization needs to determine appropriate handling, storage, distribution, and traceability activities. 7.2, customer-related processes. 7.2.1 addresses determining the requirements related to product. The new requirement here is the organization has to determine if there's any user training needed to ensure the performance and safe use of the medical device. So does the device need a trainer, a manual, or a set of instructions? 7.2.2 is the review of requirements related to the product. This review has to occur prior to the organization committing to supply product to the customer and ensure that applicable regulatory requirements are met in any user training that has been previously identified as part of the 7.2.1 exercise is or will be made available. Section 7.3 gets into design. There are a lot of changes here. Interestingly, the requirement for management of interfaces was eliminated. 7.3.2, design and development planning. The organization has to, in the planning stage, determine the reviews that will be needed at each design and development stage, and the methods that will be used to ensure traceability of the design and development outputs back to the design and development inputs, as well as the resources needed, including the competence of personnel. Seven 7.3.3, design and development inputs. Inputs relating to product requirements must be determined and records maintained. There's a new input, and that's usability requirements. And the design inputs shall be able to be verified or validated. Now, in the planning stage, you're going to determine what reviews are needed. When you're actually doing these reviews, the records of the design reviews must include the identification of the design under review and who was involved and the date the review was conducted. 736, design and development verification. The organization is required to document verification plans that include the methods that are to be used, what the acceptance criteria are, and as appropriate, statistical techniques to be used with a rationale for the sample size. In your verification activities, if the intended use of the medical device requires connection or interface with another, then the verification activity needs to be set up that way to ensure that design outputs meet the design inputs when it is actually connected or interfaced. And records of these verification activities and any conclusions drawn must be maintained. And you're going to see that 737 reads in parallel. There needs to be a plan for the validation activity, including the method that's going to be used, as well as what the acceptance criteria are. If sampling is appropriate, there needs to be a rationale for the sample size. And a rationale for choice of product needs to be recorded. Again, if the intended use or functioning of the device requires connection or interface with another, the validation protocol needs to flow out that way. And records of the validation activities and any conclusions drawn need to be maintained. There's a new requirement in 738 for design and development transfer. The organization has to have a procedure for transfer of the design and development outputs to manufacturing. So this is a brand new procedural requirement relating to the transfer of design and development outputs to manufacturing. The procedure has to include steps to ensure that outputs are verified as suitable for manufacturing before becoming final production specs, and that production capability can meet product requirements. And results and conclusions of the transfer need to be recorded. 739, design and development changes. The organization needs to determine the significance of the change to the function, performance, usability, safety, and any applicable regulatory requirements for the medical device and its intended use. The review of the change shall include evaluation of the effect on the change on the parts, any work in process, the delivered product, and inputs and outputs of risk management in the product realization process. 7310 is a requirement for the design and development file. The organization must maintain a design development file for each device or family, and the file must include a reference records generated to demonstrate conformity to the requirements for design and development, and include a reference records for design and development changes. 741 gets into purchasing. There's new criteria for evaluation and selection of suppliers, and it fits the theme that we've been talking about. So these criteria need to consider the performance of the supplier. So perhaps the criteria are less rigorous for a consistently good performing supplier that may maintain certification by an independent third-party registrar, and also be proportionate to the risk associated with the medical device. So depending on what the component part is, for example, if it's an active component for an implantable device, there's certainly more risk associated with maybe the raw material used in a tongue depressor. The organization needs to have a plan for monitoring and reevaluating their suppliers, including the supplier's ability to meet requirements for purchased product. And the results of this monitoring shall be an input to the supplier reevaluation process. So some suppliers may get monitored more often than others based on the criticality of what they provide or their performance. If purchasing requirements are not met, these inconsistencies need to be handled based on the risk associated with the purchased product and in compliance with applicable regulatory requirements. Records of the process need to be maintained. Purchasing information, POs, terms and condition documents, supplier quality manuals need to include, as applicable, a written agreement that the supplier notify the organization of changes in the purchased product prior to implementation of the change that affects the ability of the purchased product to meet specified requirements. Again, I'm going to have a hard time providing an example of when a change may not affect the ability of the purchased product to meet specified requirements. 743, verification of purchased product. When the organization becomes aware of any changes to the purchased product, the organization must determine whether these changes impact the product realization process or the medical device, and thus their verification activities need to change. (752) Cleanliness of product. The organization shall document requirements for cleanliness of product or contamination control of the product if the product cannot be cleaned prior to sterilization or its use, and its cleanliness is of significance to its use. If an organization carries out servicing, 754, the organization shall analyze the servicing records, often existing as service reports or field reports, that are carried out by the organization itself or its suppliers, and determine if the need for a service call has to be handled as a complaint, and they should be an input to the continual improvement process as appropriate. (756) addresses the validation of processes for production and service provision. There's a requirement for the organization to have a documented procedure for validation of processes. And this procedure has to include revalidation steps and criteria for revalidation and approval of changes to processes. There is and has always been a requirement for validation of software. Again, the specific approach used needs to be proportionate to the associated risk of the software and its impact on the ability of the product to meet specified requirements. The records of results, conclusions, and any necessary actions from validation activities need to be maintained. (757) contains requirements for those organizations that perform sterilization or use sterile barrier systems. The processes need to be validated prior to implementation and following product process changes. I encourage you to take a look at 11607-1 and 2. And of course, there's a requirement for records of any results, conclusions, and necessary actions resulting from validation activities. 758 talks about identification. If required by regulatory requirements, the organization shall have a system to assign a unique device identification to the medical device. Again, it's going to depend on the commodity that's being manufactured. The organization shall have documented procedures to ensure that medical devices returned to the organization are identified and distinguished from conforming product. 7511, preservation of product. Product must be protected from alteration, contamination, damage during manufacturing or processing, storage, handling, and distribution through the use of the design and construction of suitable packaging and shipping containers. Documented instructions for special conditions needed if packaging alone is not sufficient. And if any special conditions are needed, they should be controlled and recorded. The organization must have a documented procedure for feedback. And remember, feedback in a general sense is an input to management review that includes production and post-production activities. That means servicing or installation. Feedback gathered shall be a potential input into risk management for monitoring and maintaining product requirements, as well as the product realization or improvement processes. 822, complaint handling. This represents a reorganization of the standard. Previously, 822 was internal audits. New section on complaint handling. A documented procedure is required for the timely handling, and regulatory requirements need to be adhered to here. If you make a decision not to investigate a complaint, that justification for not doing so needs to be documented. If in its problem solving, the organization determines that activities outside of the organization contributed to the complaint, the relevant information needs to be shared with the other parties and records have to be maintained. 823, reporting to regulatory authorities, again, a new requirement. If applicable, regulatory requirements require notification of complaints. That means specified reporting criteria or adverse events or issuance of advisory notices. The organization has to document procedures for providing notification to the appropriate regulatory authorities. And records of any reports made to regulatory authorities needs to be maintained. Your monitoring and measurement of the product itself, those records need to identify the measurement and test equipment used to perform the measurement activities, maybe by recording the unique ID number of the gauge used. 8.3, control of non-conforming product. Again, there's a requirement for a documented procedure. This procedure needs to include the responsibilities and authorities for identification, documentation, segregation, evaluation, and disposition of the non-conforming product. The evaluation piece has to include a determination of the need for an investigation and notification to any external party responsible for the non-conformity, and records of the evaluation, investigation, or rationale for any decisions made need to be documented, need to be maintained. 832 and 833 are now separate sections. So 832 addresses actions in response to non-conforming product detected before delivery, is separate from 833, actions that need to be taken in response to non-conforming product detected after delivery. In 832, non-conforming product accepted by concession, only if justification is provided, approval is obtained, and applicable regulatory requirements are met. In 833, the organization has to document procedures for issuing advisory notices in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. Procedures have to be able to be implemented at any point in time, so they have to be ready for immediate implementation, and records of implementation need to be maintained. 8.4, analysis of data. There's a requirement for a procedure here. It includes the methods that are going to be used, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. And the analysis of data needs to include input from audits and service reports as applicable. So using all inputs that are appropriate. 8.52, 8.53, corrective and preventive action. There are required procedures here, and they include a verification that the corrective or preventive action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety performance of the device. So you need to show that your problem solving is considering these two things. And I thank you for your time and attention today, and I'll now open the floor to any questions that you may have. As all participants have been muted to ensure sound quality, please type your questions into the question feature. Okay, get some questions coming in. Organization is sharing a particular scenario at their company. Last year they were 9001, 2008, and they've recently incorporated the requirements of AS 9100D. What would be our increased audit time if we went for 1345, 2016? Difficult to say, John. It depends on a number of factors. Number one, what it is you're manufacturing. Are you the legal manufacturer? Are there sterility or design requirements associated with your device? Are you making a component part only? And is the component part you make for the medical device similar to the component parts you're making for your aerospace customers? So really difficult to say. Employee count will also impact that. We'll need to talk offline about that. Okay, getting a question from Sunil on how to, asking me to explain on how to conform to the requirements of purchase information. So let's go back to that. I want to make sure I'm looking at the right slide. And Sunil, if you don't mind, if you would just let me know that I've pulled up the slide that you in fact have a question about. I believe it's 742. Purchasing information needs to include, as applicable, a written agreement that the supplier notified the organization of changes in the purchased product prior to them making those changes. So they have to tell you that they plan to make a change before they actually make the change. And this is really specific to the types of changes that affect the ability of the purchased product to meet specified requirements. So if your supplier is changing one of their suppliers, they're using a new raw material or a new raw material supplier, that's potentially a significant change. They need to notify you before they start using that new supplier or that new raw material from the same supplier. This would typically be flowed down in a purchase order, terms and conditions associated with the contract, or maybe a supplier quality manual you issue to your suppliers. James is asking, what are the competency requirements for internal auditors? That's an easy question, James. Your organization sets those competency requirements. The only thing our auditor is going to do with those is make sure that they're meaningful. I would expect that your auditors need to be competent in the 1345 standard. They need to be competent in the applicable regulatory requirements as well as customer requirements. They know how to conduct an audit. They know how to ask questions, interview, observe, draw conclusions, and document results. If your competency requirements say that they all have to be 6'2", wear the color purple, and can juggle, probably not the most meaningful competency requirements. So you set the competency requirements. They obviously have to be relevant, and you have to show that your people meet them, whether internal auditors or any position in your organization. Wait a few more minutes to see if any other questions come in. Again, copies of the slides and a recording of today's webinar are available at www.pgr.com. It's also here on our website that you can get information on new and upcoming webinars. There's a whole schedule posted. Okay, getting a question from James. How does a company show validation of software programs such as general application programs? And I think you mean Microsoft Office Suite. Yeah, it depends on how that's used. If you use Microsoft Office products for your general software, you know, to conduct business in your organization, compile presentations for spreadsheets, to type out Word documents or internal communication, probably little to no validation is needed. You're buying an off-the-shelf software program. If you're setting up an Excel spreadsheet that contains maybe statistical information about design validation, you may want to validate that Excel spreadsheet to make sure that it's working, maybe by entering dummy data. So the level of validation needed for that software is going to be much different than maybe an internally designed software program for embedded software in an active implantable device. I hope that answers your question, James. So consider, is it a well-known off-the-shelf program versus an internally designed software program that's going to be part of an embedded active device? Another example, if the type of medical device you have contains or gives you access to PHI, personal health information, and you're using a software program that encrypts certain information or identity of patients, is that working? That's certainly something that would need to be validated. We'll wait a few more minutes to see if any additional questions come in. And again, I think the two most common themes in the new version of the standard are risk throughout the process, not just related to production, as well as the increased emphasis on regulatory requirements. There needs to be a consideration of regulatory requirements regardless of where you're at in the supply chain. Wait just one more minute and then we'll conclude if there's no additional questions. Okay, folks, I appreciate your time today. And again, check out our website. Oh, question coming in last minute. I'll gladly answer that. Okay, I'm going to read the question as it's written. I'm not sure I understand it. So, Sunil, you may want to submit some clarification. Here, risk is associated with the harm. Is it harm to humans or also the malfunctioning of the device? It would certainly be both. Both would need to be considered. I'm not sure I'm addressing your question. Certainly there's risk associated with the device not performing as intended, but perhaps not causing harm, or the device not performing as intended and as well causing harm. I have a feeling I'm not understanding your question though. Okay, in conclusion, slides can be downloaded from www.pgr.com, as well as a recording of today's webinar. And you can also access information about new and upcoming webinars on our schedule. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.